Picture this, July 1969. 500 million people around the world are glued to their TV sets. 3 Americans are about to land on the moon, and the rocket that sent them there, the most powerful machine ever built by human hands, was designed by a German man who, just 24 years earlier, had been an officer in the Nazi SS. Nobody was talking about that part. This is the story of Operation Paperclip. And once you know it, you'll never look at the space race the same way again. Let's go back to the spring of 1945. World War II is almost over in Europe. The Allied armies are pushing through Germany from the west, and the Soviet forces are coming in from the east. Hitler's regime is falling apart. Cities are in rubble, and in the chaos, something unexpected is happening. American soldiers are stumbling onto labs, underground factories, warehouses full of blueprints, and they're finding technology that honestly shocks them. Jet engines, guided missiles, rockets. Stuff that, in some cases, was years ahead of anything the US had. And the people who built all of it, the scientists and engineers, many of them are still alive, still in Germany, waiting to see what comes next. Here's the thing though, the Americans weren't the only ones who wanted them. The Soviet Union was closing in from the other side, and both superpowers knew the same thing. Whoever got these scientists would have a massive advantage in whatever came after the war, so a race started. Not a race for land, a race for brains. The US put together a team. They called themselves the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, which is a very fancy way of saying, grab as much as you can. These guys followed right behind the combat troops, going into German facilities and scooping up documents, equipment, and people. Then they got incredibly lucky, in the strangest way possible. In March of 1945, a Polish lab worker was searching through Bonn University, and there, stuffed inside a toilet, he found pieces of paper. Someone had tried to flush them. When investigators pieced them back together, they had a list of names. Hundreds of names, scientists and engineers, who had been pulled from the front lines to work on Germany's most secret projects. It was called the Osenberg List, and it basically handed the Americans a ready-made shopping list of the best scientific minds in the Third Reich. The operation that followed was first called Operation Overcast, but then it got a new name, one that tells you a lot about how the whole thing worked. The people running it used paper clips to attach a clean, new summary sheet to the front of each scientist's file. The summary only showed what they wanted you to see: the real history, the Nazi Party membership, the SS records, the things these men actually did during the war. That was hidden underneath, and so they called it Operation Paperclip. Now, if you know one name from this story, it's probably Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was 33 years old when the war ended, and he was already one of the most gifted rocket engineers who had ever lived. He had grown up obsessed with space. As a teenager, he taught himself advanced math just so he could understand how rockets worked. By the time the Nazis came to power, he was already deep in Germany's military rocket program. At the Peenemünde research base on the northern coast of Germany, von Braun led the team that built the V-2. The V-2 was the world's first long-range ballistic missile. It flew faster than the speed of sound, which meant you couldn't hear it coming. No air raid siren could warn you in time. Between 1944 and 1945, thousands of these things were fired at cities, London, Antwerp, and others, killing thousands of civilians. But here's something von Braun always wanted you to focus on instead. He cared about space. He said the V-2 was just a stepping stone, that his real dream was always exploration, that he was a scientist first. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937. In 1940, he became an SS officer, a Sturmbannführer, which is roughly equivalent to a major. The SS wasn't just a military unit. It was the organization that ran the concentration camps, that oversaw the Holocaust. Von Braun would later say he had no real choice, that joining was just the price of being allowed to do his work, that he was never really a true believer. What was harder to avoid talking about was the factory. After British bombers hit Peenemünde in August 1943, the Nazi leadership decided to move V-2 production somewhere safer, underground. They picked a tunnel system carved into a mountain near a town called Nordhausen in central Germany. They called it Mittelwerk, which just means central works. And to dig those tunnels and build those rockets, they used concentration camp prisoners. The camp they set up next to the factory was called Dora. Later, it became known as Mittelbau Dora. More than 60,000 people were imprisoned there. And in the early months, the conditions were beyond brutal. Prisoners slept inside the tunnels they were digging, on bare rock, underground, with no real light. Barely any food, no toilets, just barrels cut in half. They breathed in dust and chemical fumes around the clock. Hundreds of people died every single month. They were so many deaths that the SS had to build a crematorium just to handle them. By the time the war ended, at least 10,000 people had died building the V2 rocket. Here is the fact that hits different when you really let it sink in. More people died building that rocket than were killed by it when it was fired. Von Braun visited that factory multiple times. He walked those production lines. He met with the people running the facility. He consulted on the technical side of things. And he came back again years later when he was asked about it. He said he had deep regret for what happened. He blamed the SS. He said he was focused on the engineering. Whether you accept that answer, that's something you're going to have to decide for yourself. Now let's talk about another man, Arthur Rudolph. Rudolph had actually joined the Nazi Party even earlier than von Braun, back in 1931. During the war, he was the chief operations director at Mittelwerk. That means he was the one managing the day-to-day running of the factory. He was the one responsible for keeping production going, whatever that took. He was there, not occasionally, constantly. When the war ended, Rudolph was brought to the United States as part of Operation Paperclip, alongside von Braun and over 100 other rocket specialists. They arrived at Fort Bliss in Texas in the fall of 1945. On paper, they were listed as War Department Special Employees. Their real backgrounds had been quietly cleaned up by American intelligence officials who decided that the rules, President Truman's actual rules, didn't apply here. Because Truman had specifically said, no Nazis, no war criminals, no SS members. That was the official policy. And the people running Operation Paperclip looked at that policy, looked at the scientists, and basically said, we'll handle it. They altered records. They left things out. They moved the paperclip to the front of the file and hoped nobody looked too closely at what was underneath. For the next few years, the Germans lived a strange kind of half-life in Texas. They weren't prisoners, but they weren't exactly free either. They worked. They launched captured V2 rockets at the White Sands test range in New Mexico. They ate at diners. They learned English. Some of them said later that Americans were far friendlier than they'd expected. In 1950, the whole team moved to Huntsville, Alabama, and most of them became American citizens a few years after that. Then, in October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite ever put into orbit. It was a small metal ball beeping as it circled the Earth, and it terrified Americans. The space race was suddenly real and urgent, and the German rocket team in Huntsville suddenly went from being a quiet military asset to being America's most important people. Von Braun and his team helped launch Explorer 1, the first American satellite, just a few months later. When NASA was officially created in 1960, von Braun became the first director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He did a TV special with Walt Disney. He became one of the most famous men in the country, the face of American ambition, the guy who was going to take humanity into space. Arthur Rudolph became the director of the Saturn V program in 1965. The Saturn V, the rocket that carried Apollo 11 to the moon. Kurt Debus, another former SS member, became the first director of the Kennedy Space Center, the launch site, the place every single Apollo mission lifted off from. And today, if you look at a map of the moon, you'll find two craters named after Operation Paperclip scientists. One is named von Braun, the other is named Debus. They are, quite literally, written into the surface of the moon. For most of the Cold War, None of this was public knowledge. The government kept it quiet, the scientists kept it quiet, and honestly, most Americans were just focused on winning. Winning the space race, winning the arms race, beating the Soviets. The fact that the men making it happen had Nazi records felt like, to a lot of people in power anyway, like a problem for later. A comedian named Tom Lehrer wrote a song about von Braun in 1965. The joke was simple. Once the rocket goes up, who cares where it comes down? That's not my department, says Wernher von Braun. People laughed. But you could feel the discomfort underneath it. The survivors of Dora Mittelbau tried to speak up. Former prisoners wrote letters, gave interviews, testified to courts. They wanted people to know that real human beings, tens of thousands of them, had suffered and died to build these rockets. For the most part, during the Cold War years, the world wasn't very interested in hearing it. The scientists were heroes now. The story had been written. The paperclip was doing its job. In the 1970s, investigative journalists started digging. Congressional hearings happened. The questions that had been buried for 30 years were finally coming out in public. Who knew what? Who signed off on hiding it? What did America actually trade away when it made this deal? In 1979, the Justice Department opened a new office with one specific job: track down Nazi war criminals living in the United States and hold them accountable. And in 1982, Arthur Rudolph got a letter. He was 75 years old. He lived quietly in San Jose, California. His neighbors thought he was a sweet old man who took walks with his wife every evening. He had a NASA Distinguished Service Medal. He had been celebrated by the New York Times as a key figure in the moon landing. But the investigators had been reading the real files, the ones that had been buried for 4 decades. After a series of interviews, and Rudolph would later say he felt pressured and wasn't in great health, he made a decision. In March 1984, he and his wife got on a plane to Germany. In May of that year, at the U.S. consulate in Hamburg, he handed back his American citizenship. Under the deal, he wouldn't be prosecuted. His pension would stay intact. He would just quietly leave. The Washington Post headline said he'd been charged with working thousands of slave laborers to death. He denied it until the end. He died in Hamburg in 1996, 90 years old, never stood trial. Wernher von Braun never faced anything like that. He died in 1977 at 65 years old of cancer. He was celebrated right up to the end. He received the National Medal of Science. He had an entire arena in Huntsville named after him. For most people who knew about the space program, he was simply a hero. In February 1969, just 5 months before the moon landing, von Braun was asked to give testimony to a West German court that was trying former SS guards from the Dora camp. He showed up. He spoke. Afterward, he told reporters he had deep regret for the victims, but he had spent his whole career in America carefully avoiding the subject. And he got away with it. So, where does that leave us? Here's the honest truth. Operation Paperclip worked. The rockets flew. The moon landing happened. The technology it produced shaped the modern world. Those are real things. They happened. And here's the other honest truth. It happened because the United States government looked at a group of men, some of whom were directly connected to one of the worst crimes in human history, and decided their skills were worth more than the truth. They cleaned up the files. They broke their own rules. And the people who had suffered the most, the prisoners in those tunnels, the people who never got their names in Time magazine, they were left to carry that weight largely alone. Both of those things are true at the same time. That's what makes this story so hard to put down. It's not a clean villain story. It's not a clean hero story. It's a story about what people are willing to trade away and what gets left behind when they do. The rocket went up. The men on it were brave. The achievement was real, and somewhere underneath all of that, in tunnels carved out of a mountain in Germany, in the names nobody teaches you in school, in the gap between the official story and the real one, there are people who deserve to be remembered too. Their names weren't written on the moon, but they should be part of the story we tell.